This is such a familiar story. We all know this, well, I assume we all know this story. And if I were to ask, well, what do we know about Judas Iscariot? We could go on for quite some time throwing out things that we know about him, things that we assume, things that we speculate. He's not a man with a great reputation within the church. In fact, he's not a man with a great reputation even out in the world. In the world, outside the body of Christ, if you call someone a Judas, they know what you're saying, even if they don't know the story. And it's an insult. And for some, it is just a story. At times, certain stories in the Bible become so caricatured that they seem to us almost like these Sunday school line drawings that our kids bring home from their study materials. And in this same way, Judas becomes this mustache-twirling, snidely whiplash character. And we don't like him. So I'm constantly telling myself that these are real people, just like you and just like me. They're not line drawings. These are people who had families. They were people who experienced joy and elation and sorrow. They worried about their children. They had dreams and ambitions. They got angry. They worried about how to feed themselves. They worried about, is there enough rain for the crops to grow? They hated taxes. So these are real people with real lives in a real context. And so what I want to do today is to walk through this event that Sears just read to us, this event of Judas and his betrayal. And I want to look for things, clues, things that we might have missed, things that we might have read over and just a little too quickly so they didn't really register. And then I want to propose a scenario for you, okay? Purely a conjecture on my part, a speculation, if you will, to try to figure out why did Judas do what he did. Because, and I am in no way excusing this, okay? It was awful. This was a betrayal that was beyond mammoth proportions. But I do want to wrap my mind around it. I want to understand it. I like things to make sense. And as a bad joke teller, I'm going to give you the punchline up front, at least part of it, and tell you what I think is going on here. I am persuaded that the betrayal of Judas against Jesus was done with zero malice. Okay, he wasn't trying to be snidely whiplash. He wasn't trying to be nasty. And then, it is my conviction that things played out in a way that Judas never expected. And when Jesus was brutally put to death, and Judas saw that, I believe it was Judas' worst nightmare coming true right before his eyes. And that explains why Judas did what he did after the crucifixion. If you're not familiar with that, following Jesus' beatings and execution, Judas committed suicide. He couldn't take it. So let's dig into this. Now, no matter how we spin it, Judea is an occupied territory. We're talking about decades way before the birth of Jesus. Judea has been an occupied territory. And it's a fascinating study to look at this history that led up to this today. You can see the Hasmoneans and the rise of John Hyrcanus. You can look at who followed him was Antipater, and the Herodians moved in. We see prior to that with this infamous Maccabean revolt, the history of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids. I mean, it is fascinating, but it will make your head spin. trying to keep it all straight. So the one fact that's important today is that Judea is ruled by Rome. Rome is in control, and Rome is ruling with an iron fist. Judea had a Roman procurator, and Rome was the overseer of all matters, political, military, fiscal. We're in control. Now, the Jews reacted to this in ways that are, familiar and similar to the fashion anybody would react this way, being occupied. Some people, they just rolled with it. Some people just decided, let's just keep living our lives and make the best of the situation we can in our given circumstance. Others decided to use it to their advantage. All right, we're occupied. There's nothing we can do about it. These were the collaborators. These were the people who would work with and for Rome against their own people. Matthew, for example. Matthew was a collector of taxes for Rome. And he got rich off the backs of his own people. Zacchaeus, also a tax gatherer. Then there was this third group. This group had a little bit more fire in their belly. And these people, in their response to the occupation, was that they would rebel against their Roman occupiers. They staged little revolts and little uprisings all over the place. And they didn't amount to much. And a lot of these guys ended up on crosses. These were small revolts, very sporadic in nature, mostly unsuccessful. They're like a pesky mosquito, that Rome would just swat down with relative ease. Now, the Jews did mount, eventually, a significant combined revolt. They all put their forces together, and in the year AD 66, they drove the Romans out of Jerusalem. But then Nero, Nero being Nero, he worked through Vespasian and Titus, and in AD 70, August of AD 70, Jerusalem fell. And they crushed the Jews, absolutely decimated them. The temple was destroyed, and it remains destroyed to this day. The Jews who did manage to escape, they went south and they fled to this place called Masada. And this is a place where they held ground for 3 years, and then eventually General Flavius Silva came in and put them down. That place is still there, by the way. It's a museum. You can visit it if you like. So the point is, that's the atmosphere. That is the context within which this story of Judas arises. It's the kind of thing that's happening socially, politically, before, during, and after the appearance of Jesus. This is the world in which Judas and Jesus lived. This is where Judas was raised. This is what shaped him and turned him into the man that he is or was. Well, what else is happening? Because we have the benefit of history, all right, we can see way more clearly than those who at this time were looking forward to future events. We can see the old covenant and lay it next to the new covenant, and we can see prophecies and fulfillments. Prophecies and fulfillments. We know exactly what's going on. We have the entire New Testament to study, but in Jesus' day, they didn't have that. We have the witness of the apostles. We have centuries of study and notes from brilliant researchers and scholars. We know exactly who the Messiah is. But what about them? What did they know? What were they looking for? What were they expecting? When we look at the history of the nation of Israel, we see this undeniable pattern. It's a 5-step pattern. If you want to see it, you see it most clearly in Judges, but you'll see it throughout the Old Testament. We have five stages. Stage 1, the people are well behaved and things are good. Stage 2, the people misbehave and they start chasing after idols and their pagan lusts. Stage 3, God gets sick of it. gives the people over to some occupying nation or oppressor. Under their oppression, stage 4, the people cry out, "Oh, the pity, save us, O God." Stage 5, God raises up a leader, some sort, we call him a judge often. He raises up a leader who drives out the oppressors, and we revert back to stage 1. The people are well behaved and things are good. And you watch this cycle over and over and over. And God keeps raising these leaders and raising these leaders, but there is one leader, one that they are looking for, one in particular. This is the Mashiach. We call him Messiah. This is the guy who is going to come in with such force, with such power, that he obliterates all of Israel's oppressors. This is the guy who will drive out Rome with the swing of his sword. He will reinstate Israel, not just as a great nation, but as the great nation. I missed a slide there. Okay, there should be one there that says the great nation. All right, so we have the Messiah. The Messiah he's king over Israel, and Israel is king over all the nations. That is what they were expecting. That is what Judas is looking for. In the Gospel of John, we see Jesus doing some really amazing things. Most people call them miracles. John calls them signs. Signs tell us things. Signs have information. All right? So we're watching these signs. Jesus, he turns plain water, but bath water, water in which we're washing ourselves, he turns that into fine wine. John the Baptist, his cousin, the people beloved by the masses. John the Baptist points to Jesus and says, this is exactly who he is. Jesus feeds thousands of people with a handful of scraps. People who cannot walk are walking again. People who are infirm or have diseases are made whole. This guy walks on water. If you're going to choose a military leader, this is a good choice. We don't need boats anymore. Our armies march across the sea rather than around it. People who are shot with arrows or stuck with swords, Messiah heals them up and they go back and fight on. People who die aren't dead anymore. How do you defeat an army that won't die? And so with all of that going on, in John 6, we read this. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the hills by himself. For the Jew of Jesus' day, the Messiah was a revolutionary, not a religious figure. The people were convinced that Jesus is the guy. Now, I don't know how you force someone to be king, but they were going to try it. There's an early Jewish historian, a guy named Josephus, and he had this to say about the nation's messianic expectations. But now, what did the most to elevate them to undertaking this war was an ambiguous oracle that was also found in their sacred writings, how about that time, one from their country should become governor of the habitable earth. You may interpret that last phrase to say ruler of the world. That's what they're looking for. That is who they're expecting. And that's why in Mark chapter 14, when the crowd came, Peter drew his sword and he went to work. He engaged the battle. Cut off Malchus's ear. And Jesus says, hey, put your sword away. Put your sword away. Picked up Malchus's ear and put it back on. We have two wildly divergent views of kingdom here. And when we come at a subject like Messiah with preconceived ideas, preconceived notions, then we're going to look for a fulfillment of our ideas. When all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when our ideas of God's kingdom don't play out the way that we expect them to, we're left scratching our head and saying, this doesn't make any sense. And we see that exact same thing with the apostles in Acts chapter 1. Jesus was brutally killed. Their hopes were dashed. Jesus rises from the dead. Well, now they're scratching their heads again saying, well, okay, I'm not sure what to make of this, but this is better. And then in Acts chapter 1 and verse 6, they're trying to put it all together. And we see this. So when they had come together, they asked him, now, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? They're still thinking along those lines. Jesus, dead, buried, raised from the dead. They're still looking for that kingdom. Jesus is the king of Israel. Israel's the king of all the nations. So when we get to Luke 22, our target passage for today, when Judas comes up, leading the chief priests, leading the temple guard to take Jesus captive, this is what they're thinking. This is where their heads are. They're thinking Messiah. They're thinking an army that cannot be defeated. They're thinking Israel is about to rule the world, and I have a front row seat. And that's why when the mob came, Peter drew his sword and he went after Malchus's head. That's why when Judas comes up, full of confidence that the kingdom is about to appear, that's why earlier in this very same chapter, we studied this just a few weeks ago, that they are arguing. Do you remember the argument? They're arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. What kingdom? This kingdom. This is the one that they were fighting about. This is all about to go down. We're going to have thrones. We're going to have castles. We're going to wear crowns. People will bow before us in reverent awe and adoration. How wrong they were. All of them. But especially Judas. Judas never expected this to play out the way it did. I am convinced that Judas did this in an attempt to force Jesus' hand. Force him to start the rebellion. The rebellion that we all know is coming. It's taking too long. But if I bring the chief priests, if I bring the temple guard to arrest him, Jesus will spring into action. And he'll establish the king or the kingdom this week, maybe this month. If we go back to Luke chapter 19 and look at verse 11, speaking of Jesus, it says this. As they heard these things, he, Jesus, told them a parable because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. Are you starting to crawl inside their heads? Coming up 2 chapters from where we are today, in Luke 24, there's these two guys who are leaving Jerusalem. They're walking down the road back home, road to Emmaus. They're talking with each other and trying to figure out what happened this week. What did we just see? Jesus shows up and starts walking with them and talking with them. They didn't know that it was Jesus, and they told him this. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. The military kingdom that we were expecting didn't come, and we are just completely bummed out about it. Luke 22. Took us a long time to get there, but we're there. While he was still speaking, behold, a multitude came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, he was preceding them, and he approached Jesus to kiss him. Now, one of the challenges that we have as Westerners in Lynden, Washington, 2024, is that we have this need to extricate ourselves from all of the imagery that we've been fed throughout our lives by Hollywood regarding biblical stories. These were not Roman soldiers that came to arrest Jesus. We've always assumed they were Romans because Hollywood always told us that they were Romans. I don't believe the Romans are involved yet. In fact, at this point, the Romans could not care less who Jesus is or what he's doing. He is a non-issue to them. But so strongly held is this idea that it was the Romans who came to the garden to arrest Jesus that in John chapter 18 and verse 3, out of the 31 English translations I consulted, including mine, 7 of them say that they were Roman soldiers, when the translators know that that word Roman is not there. They speculate about it, and I mean, there are no shortage of scholars who believe this, that it was the Romans. And they speculate that security was beefed up this week in Jerusalem because it's Passover, and it was. That's true. And they further speculate that, well, somebody talked to these security guys and got them to come with them to arrest Jesus. I can't go there. I can't go there, one, because the text simply doesn't say it. It's just not there. Your Bibles, a lot of them, are honest enough to italicize that. So you can tell, oh, that's not really there. It's provided by the translators to help us to gain understanding. 2, there's no reason for the Romans to be engaged in a dispute that is purely over Jewish religious matters. They don't care. 3, because minutes from now, in our target passage, Jesus is going to scold the crowd saying, every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you didn't lay a hand on me. Roman soldiers aren't going to be in the Jewish temple courts listening to a rabbi teach. The Romans weren't there, but they do get involved later. I can't see any way that a Jew is going to go up to a Roman commander and say, hey, you need to come with me and arrest some guy. All he's going to get is the flat side of a sword across his back. It makes a lot more sense to me that we would see this as a mob of Jewish citizens led by the chief priests, the scribes, and the temple guard, because the text does tell us that. The Jews came and got this guy. The Jews took him to the Romans and somehow persuaded them to put him to death because they couldn't do that. The Jews can't put anybody to death while they're occupied. But they did. We know they did. They did it to Stephen. They tried to do it to others. They tried to do it to the woman who was caught in adultery. Shall we stone her? Shall we stone her, Jesus? Shall we stone her? Mark's gospel tells us that it was a mob sent by the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. And he further tells us that they are armed with clubs and swords. Matthew's gospel tells us almost the exact same thing. He just doesn't mention the scribes. So, the chief priests and the temple guard lead this mob. They're up here to arrest Jesus. And Judas has to identify who Jesus is. Now, does that strike you odd? Why would they not know who he is? There can't be more than, 15 or 20 of them gathered up there. You can't pick him out of a crowd of 15 or 20. You know that he's worthy of death. You know that, but you don't know who he is. This is bizarre. So it's kind of like mobs today. They're protesting and they're rioting and they're spraying graffiti everywhere, and they're burning things, and they're tipping over cars, and the reporter comes up and says, so what are you protesting about today? They don't know. They don't know. And sometimes one of them will turn to another. I don't know, what are we protesting? I don't know, whatever. They don't know who Jesus is. So the chief priests work out this deal with Judas. He'll identify him with a kiss. Judas approaches Jesus to make this identification. Now, it's not uncommon or irregular in any way that Judas would do this, that he would kiss Jesus. This is a very common way to greet one another throughout many, many cultures in the world. In fact, I think 3 times in our New Testament it tells us, greet one another with a holy kiss. I've been a Christ follower for about, 43 years? I've never been kissed by another Christian except my wife. So this is not an unusual thing, and actually it's really kind of a pretty good ploy. Now again, Hollywood, they have Judas coming up and kissing Jesus on the cheek. No, that would not happen. One rabbi will greet another rabbi of equal stature by kissing on the cheek. That would happen. If you're a student of a rabbi, you come in and you kiss your master on the hand. If you're a servant, either of a rabbi or just a guy, you're down on your elbows and your knees and you kiss their feet. This is how they do it. They do it this way still today. Every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, gives us little tidbits of this Judas story, and we smash them all together to try to get the complete picture. Here we see the disciples. Actually, I need to read a couple of verses to you here. So Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what was about to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And a certain one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. So they're asking, shall we engage the battle? Is this day one of the kingdom? We know from earlier in Luke, in fact, I think it was just last week, Adam told us, they only had 2 swords. There's 2 swords, there's about 15, 20 of us. Here's this mob. But you know what else they knew? They knew they were standing with the Messiah. They didn't understand that. They weren't sure what that meant, but they knew it was true. We know from John's account that it was Peter who struck with the sword. We know also from John, he gives us the name of the victim, Malchus, the servant of the high priest. I assure you, when Peter went after Malchus, he was not going for his ear. He was going to take off that guy's head. Matthew's account gives us the well-known statement, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. But Jesus answered, stop! No more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. And Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers, the officers of the temple and the elders who had come against him, have you come out with swords and clubs against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this hour, in the power of darkness, they're yours. This has to be so confusing to the disciples. We have swords, but we can't use them. Jesus willingly goes with the mob, the posse that came out to arrest him. We know from both Matthew and Mark's gospel that the entire band of disciples who was just ready to fight, they all ran away. Every one of them. In fact, Mark tells us that when the disciples were running away, somebody had to hold one of their garments, and the guy ran with such force, it ripped the garment right off him, and he ran away naked. These guys are scared. Speculation is it was Mark himself who ran off like that. Peter is so bewildered that though he was ready to fight just a moment ago, this very night, he will deny even knowing Jesus. Not once, 3 times. One of them to a little servant girl. These guys are terrified. Peter's abounding courage did a full 180. Judas has got to be completely stunned by what did not happen. He fully expected Jesus to jump into gear and establish the kingdom. Fully expecting he's going to go from gentle teacher to commanding general. I mean, with a word of his mouth, Jesus can take down every one of these guys. You remember in John chapter 7, the chief priest of the temple sent the temple guard out to arrest Jesus and bring him back. They went out and they came back empty-handed. Do you remember that? And they asked him, well, where is he? Why didn't you bring him? Do you recall their answer? They said, never has any man spoken the way this man speaks. Are you kidding me? Your job is to go out and arrest him and he makes a good speech? Don't ever underestimate the power of Jesus' words. That's why I encourage you so much, live in the red letters. There's a moment in Jesus' arrest account in John's gospel that makes this completely clear. Nope. There we go. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, who do you seek? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Oh, it didn't happen. Okay, I'll just tell you about it. Jesus said to them, I am. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with him, and when Jesus said, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. I intended to have that he struck out because it's not there. It's not in the text. I'm not bashing translators here. Please understand that. It's a hard job. And what they're doing, they're trying to help us understand. But that word he is not there. Jesus, when they came and said, well, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, he didn't say, oh, okay, yeah, you got me. That's me. No. They said, we are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said, Ego eimi, I am. It was more than they could sustain. And the entire mob ended up on their backside. In Mark chapter 6, the disciples were straining against the oars because the wind on the Sea of Galilee was against them, and they were really having a hard time. They were getting worked up and scared. Here came Jesus walking on the water. They saw him. It freaked them out. They thought he was a ghost. And he said to them, take courage. I am. 2 chapters from now, Luke chapter 24, we're going to see this again. The disciples are going to be huddled together, still trying to make sense of this. What has just happened? Why isn't this working out the way we want it to? Jesus will appear and stand among them. Once again, they're freaked out. They think they're seeing a ghost. Jesus says, why are you troubled? Why do you have doubts? Look at my hands and my feet. I am. The reason this is significant is because when God was sending Moses into Egypt to free the enslaved Hebrew people, and then just like Nate was just joking about it, he's making every excuse in the book. I can't do it this way. I can't do it for that reason. God, I just can't. I don't want to do this. And finally he says, well, okay, so when I go to Pharaoh and Pharaoh asks me, who are you? Who is this God? What's his name? What am I supposed to say? Gods have to have names. And God responded to Moses, you tell Pharaoh, I am that I am. You tell Pharaoh, I am has sent you. And when this mob says, we're looking for Jesus, and Jesus said, I am, and it knocked him to the ground. Now that had to have a profound impact on everyone in that scene, including Judas. I believe it confirmed everything that he thought was about to happen was true. Here it comes. Here it comes. I forced his hand, and now Jesus has to establish the kingdom. And instead, it ended up in his suicidal death because things didn't work out even close to the way that he expected them to. So what do we learn from all this? What's in this for us? I believe this demonstrates to us the complete counterproductivity of us trying to superimpose ourselves, our wills, our plans, our approaches on what God is doing. Judas, he thought he could help things along. If he could just put just a little incentive in front of Jesus, get this kingdom thing rolling, and it ended up in the worst, most profound nightmare of his life, and death by his own hand. Let me give you another example of this. It might help make it clear. All the way back, in Genesis chapter 12, God promised Abraham, you will be a great nation. I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you will become a blessing. Great. And the years passed. And the years passed. And the years passed. Starting to doubt. God confirmed his promise to Abraham. From your own flesh you will have an heir. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen. And the years passed. Finally, Sarai, I'll call her Sarah, she comes to Abraham and says, all right, this isn't happening. I am not bearing children for you, so we need to help God out here. You go into that tent and you have a son with my servant Hagar. And he did. He did it. And Ishmael was born. God reconfirmed his covenant with Abraham, saying, no, Ishmael is not the child of promise. You kind of messed up here, Abraham. And the years pass. And the years pass. And it is not until we get all the way up into Genesis chapter 21 that the promise is fulfilled. But all the way back in chapter 16, Abraham, the man who feared God, the man who followed God, the man who was faithful, the father of the faithful. We still call Abraham the father of the faithful. The guy who obeyed God, the guy who listened to God. In chapter 16 and verse 2 it says, and Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. And so we have Isaac and Ishmael. Hagar, Ishmael's mother, prior to all of this, when she became pregnant, there was a lot of jealousy. She was driven completely out of Abraham's family and influence. But prior to Ishmael's birth, an angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar, Ishmael's mother, and he told her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Now get this. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will dwell over against his kinsmen. Every word of that came true. And we see the effects, the ripple of it today. Ishmael had 12 sons, and just like Isaac, Ishmael became a great nation, 2 great nations, too many to even count. And just like God promised, Isaac and Ishmael butted heads, and they have been butting heads ever since to this day. You see it on your nightly news. We can trace this conflict back thousands of years to Genesis 16, when Abraham and Sarah decided to take matters into their own hands and just help God out. Or look at Jonah. Look at Jonah. God gave Jonah very specific instructions. Go to Nineveh. The city of Nineveh needed to be told to repent. Well, Jonah didn't want to do that. Now, I get that Nineveh was a nasty city. I understand that. And that Jonah would much prefer Nineveh just go the way of Sodom and Gomorrah. But that's not what God said. God said, go and preach to Nineveh. Well, Jonah decided that he had a better idea. And he spent 3 days inside of a fish. Now, that's just rude. Look at the Hebrew people in the wilderness following their exodus from slavery in Egypt. They're standing right on the border of the land of promise, and God tells them, step over that line and take the land. Oh, no. We can't do that. See, these guys are big and they're gnarly looking. So instead of getting the promised land, what they got was 40 years walking in circles in the wilderness. Every time we read about this promised land, God speaking of the promised land, he says it is the land that I am giving to Israel. I don't think they would have even had to fight for it. How many times do we read in the Old Testament of the enemies of Israel fighting amongst themselves? They're beating each other up. They're killing themselves. Israel doesn't have to fire a single shot. Instead, Israel, they're standing around on the periphery or something. They're doing stuff like breaking water pots and blowing trumpets. That's how you win a war. It is absurdity on display. But God said, take the land. It's yours. But no. I want to invite the band to come back up. We could look at so many other examples just like these. Judas and Abraham and Sarah decided that God needed them to help things along. Just give the kingdom a rolling start. Jonah and the Hebrew people, they knew exactly what God was asking of them. But they had a better idea. They're like Ford Motor Company. We have a better idea. We would be wise to take a lesson from these historical accounts and many, many others like them, and let God be God while we be his servants. When God says a thing is so, it is so. When God says this is how I want it done, that's how he wants it done. Sometimes things God asks of us seem so silly. I mean, how can he really mean this? Walk around the city 7 times, blow trumpets and yell. Trust me, the walls will fall down. And they did. From our limited perspective, it might appear that our idea makes so much more sense. We should do this. But all we're doing is we're sowing seeds of turmoil and trouble. And we bring that turmoil on ourselves. And we reap from the seeds that we sow. Stand and join this song, this last song, and I'll come back and close this up. The very last thing that we read in our target passage today in Luke 22, this is so ominous sounding. While I was with you daily in the temple court, you did not lay hands on me, but here, in this hour, and the power of darkness are yours. In John chapter 13, we have the scene of the Last Supper, and there's this discussion about, well, who's the one that's going to betray you? And Jesus says, hey, John, it's the one I'm going to give this morsel to. He feeds the morsel to Judas. And then he tells Judas, go out and do what you have to do. And Judas went out from their number, and it was night. That's a way to introduce that. Judas went out from among them, and it was night. In Ephesians, we're told For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. These are our choices. These are our choices. We have these choices right now. We can walk as darkness, or we can follow God's lead and walk as children of light. And I'll leave you with this. Ephesians 5:16. Nope, sorry, that's chapter 6. Therefore, be careful how you walk. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil.